The member for Bowman.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. And of course the opposition supports the government on this occasion, even though we appreciate that there is a significant element of retrospectivity to what is being introduced. We feel that it doesn't contravene any fundamental principles of fairness to do so, and on those grounds we do support the bill. We want to note also that Australia has a long tradition, as previous speakers have noted, both of a strong welfare safety net, but also I think a community expectation that that money has to come from somewhere. And therefore we are one of the few countries that does so effectively and in such a targeted way means test our welfare payments. And many people don't realise that many of the social welfare economies of the rest of the OECD don't means test in the way we do, and in fact are far less progressive in that way, in that they allow people to take an aged welfare payment commensurate with their earnings through their career, something that does not happen in Australia and something that we never want to forget, that many hard-working Australians do end up being means-tested out of further state support. And regardless of your view about that, we do need to remember there's a significant working middle class that doesn't get the aged care support that they might well have in identical circumstances in other nations. So from that, I think what we've seen is over the last 2 decades a shift in thinking from the belief that welfare is a fundamental right to a belief that it is, after all, a privilege that is, first of all, collected from other Australians, and then one that is paid as a privilege, a part of being an Australian. And therefore we have laws, and we expect anyone to adhere to those, from east to west coast, whatever your background. You have to play by the rules. And I think that Australian sense of fairness comes out no more strongly than in the idea that one should never abuse payments that one receives through our welfare system. There are many dimensions to combating welfare fraud, and I think every state wants to strike a balance between having those strict eligibility tests that are easy enough to understand and that everyone can appreciate and feel that they're fair, but also know that for those that contravene those willingly and knowingly, that there will be a robust prosecution policy. And the fact that there have been over 30,000 prosecutions I think is a fair indication of that. And that ordinary Australians out there would understand that being a dole cheat or a welfare cheat is not something that's acceptable anymore, not something that you can laugh about or pat your mate on the back about. And that change has come quite significantly over the last 2 decades through successive policy of successive administrations. One doesn't want to have such an invasive and aggressive policy that you deter people from applying for Centrelink support, nor that it's overly intrusive or punitive. There still needs to be an element of self-reporting, and that needs to be encouraged, not dissuaded. And what's very important about this amendment is, as my previous speaker has suggested, the Shadow Minister, that there will be no new prosecutions as a result of this change, just ensuring that none of the old prosecutions are brought back to be reviewed through the new light of potentially a High Court decision. In all of these, of course, you're constantly weighing up the prima facie case of whether there is a need to overturn versus the public interest. And I think most people here, together with most Australians, would admit that it is in the public interest to support the previous prosecutions that have occurred over the last 2 decades. The great risk, of course, of not standing up to it is that fraud then becomes more prevalent, and then Australians around the country lose their confidence that this is a welfare system that properly targets those who need it most. So right now what we see is that social security recipients, certainly in my electorate, understand the rules and will stand by them. But we feel that if this legislation isn't supported, that's been put forward, then a whole lot of new cases can potentially be opened. The last thing we want is those prosecutions being called into question. And while there's not really any understanding of how many of those are potentially coming before the courts, it could be only a matter of days or weeks where that would occur. And were this bill not to be passed promptly, expeditiously, then of course we could be opening up an enormous burden upon Centrelink, and particularly upon the Commonwealth, to defend cases where we probably feel that in a whole lot of instances, with how much time has passed and the detail of records that we hold, that would be very, very difficult cases to defend. I guess I also wanted to note that these sort of changes would be completely in line with what the average person would have thought held in the first place. And the fact that it looks now like you can basically drive a bus through a loophole, at the time it was extremely difficult to expect Centrelink drafters of Commonwealth law to understand that it could run contrary to an element of the criminal code. So that's very, very important that it changes. We also note that the Commonwealth has ceased prosecuting a whole range of cases that most of us would argue should be prosecuted and not delayed. So that's another very, very good reason to continue Australia's great work that we've done in avoiding Centrelink fraud to ensure that that is not derailed. Now, finally, there will be some changes, of course, that make it really, really clear that for someone who is making a claim for social security or for access to a concession card or is currently receiving it and hold those privileges, or if they're not receiving a social security payment but to whom one at any time has been paid, or they don't currently hold a card but at some time in the past have, that they will also be subject to these new rules. So I think that is completely reasonable, that we should support those changes, and that very, very importantly, there is no way ever that Centrelink fraud should be considered a legitimate activity in this country, and that is the important reason why both sides should be supporting this change.